My name is Yvette, and I believe that Title IX exists to protect women's sports for women and girls.
I'm Laura Tragonic, and I believe some trans women and girls belong more in sports with their female peers.
I don't agree with Laura.
And I don't agree with Yvette, but I believe we can still discuss this topic respectfully and honestly.
We agree to disagree about gender.
Now, I may not change Yvette's mind.
And I may not change Laura's.
But I might make you think.
And I might make you think. What we're talking about this week is that in a few days, the Supreme Court of the United States is going to be hearing two cases, Little versus Hecox and West Virginia versus BPJ. And the crux of these two cases is whether or not excluding trans girls and trans women from women's sports is a violation of either Title IX or the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, so, part of the reason that, obviously, for any of you who saw our original two episodes where we sort of had, we're very focused on sort of evergreen type of issues in the trans community. The first one, we were talking about single-sex spaces, which is, of course, a major area of contention. And then last week, for those of you who had a chance to hear our most recent show, we had I think a very honest conversation about why we believe what we believe about pediatric gender transition. And as we move forward, rather than keeping it about sort of topics, we wanted to engage a little bit with what's going on in the news. And, as Yvette was mentioning, this week is actually a really important week in sort of translegal news, because we have these two very important Supreme Court cases that have got quite a lot of energy around them, because this is going to be the first opportunity for the Supreme Court to basically rule on an issue that I think has really been one of the main cornerstone issues that I think really got a lot of people energized about trans issues, which is about trans sports. And I'll just talk about this from my perspective a little bit first, because I remember, I believe it was in 2022, that I remember I was in Barcelona during the Olympics, and I was running, and I remember listening to a podcast, and it was the first time I heard about Leah Thomas. So Leah Thomas, as I'm sure anybody who pays any attention to the trans discourse knows, was a collegiate swimmer who had competed, who was on the University of Pennsylvania women's team, despite the fact that she was born male, and had only recently started transitioning and was quite a competitive swimmer, not a top of the world swimmer, but a competitive swimmer as a male. And when she joined the University of Pennsylvania women's team, she became, I don't want to say dominant, but obviously very competitive, to the point that she was either winning races or strongly competitive in races, sort of a top 20, if she wasn't a top finisher, top 10, top 20 finisher, whereas as a male, she was ranked in the mid-hundreds. And in addition, there was also just the visual contrast. And I talk a lot about optics, and how, even regardless of what the underlying truth is, that optics and how things look actually change a lot of minds. And Leah Thomas, through no fault of her own, it's just her genetics, was a very large-boned, tall person who stood out from her female competitors. And whether you believed at the time that trans women had an advantage or were disadvantaged because of the effects of hormones, and that it still was a very striking visual context. And what a lot of people's first exposure to trans discourse was watching a trans woman who, unfortunately, looked masculine, definitely when she was standing next to her peers, doing exceedingly well in women's competition. And I think this brought a lot of additional eyes towards trans issues in general. And it started with sports, but eventually moved on to other things. So when did you first sort of take notice of trans women in sports? Like, this was like, and I don't want to say like I never heard of the issue before, but this was sort of like, for trans people, or for trans women like me, this was kind of like my oh no moment. Like, this is all going to come crashing down kind of moment. But what was your first like exposure to this?
It first came on my radar, I think, prior to Leah Thomas. I believe there was a high school in Connecticut where on the girls' track team, there were two natal male competitors who smoked. Everyone. They're clearly male. They clearly have every single male advantage. And when female class teammates complained, they were told it was their problem. With Leah Thomas, it was already well on my radar. And, the issues with Thomas on the women's team are beyond having big male shoulders, long male arms, having male strength, even if it's clocked back a little bit. Like, there are all these physical advantages. It included that in the locker room, that Thomas's female teammates are expected to change their clothes right next to Thomas,
Yeah.
who is a completely intact male.
Yeah.
And when girls brought this up, they're told to go talk to the counselor to get over their issues.
Yeah. To get over
And
the,
it was just a egregious violation of the safety and dignity of the teammates.
Yeah. So, I think those two are related issues because, when we're talking about sports, we're not just talking about the competition, but often about the team and the bonds that form between teammates and how the presence of a trans person, in this case, in that environment, was causing a disruption. And I do also remember the time that this sort of, the politics as they were that there was not really a space for women who felt uncomfortable about that to voice those opinions. But if I was to go back, like when I was thinking about trans women athletes, one of the other differences was before Leah Thomas, and I'm sort of familiar with this case in Connecticut, these were two runners, is that there was almost like a lionization of some trans athletes. And I think it was also because the trans athletes who were getting platformed were very different. So if I recall, I believe it was at either the 2020 or the 2024 Olympics. I wish there was an actual commercial, I think it was either a Nike or a Reebok commercial that featured a trans woman volleyballer. And and it was being put in there as like, look at us, aren't we amazing? Look how diverse, look how much we respect diversity. Or people people who are facing, trans women face a lot of challenges, and here's someone who's risen above, and now she's playing volleyball for the Brazilian beach volleyball team. And it was a feel good story almost. Now, for me, it was a feel good story. Obviously, I'm on Team Trans, but I don't know how it played to anyone else. But one of the obvious differences is once again, when we talk about optics, is this Brazilian player looked physically female. Now, I never saw her physically, like face to face, but at least in those commercials, she was someone who was had what appeared to be a female athletic body. And I think it wasn't just the physical, whether she had physical advantages or not. She very well could have, but it was kind of given a free pass because of the optics in a lot of ways. Leah Thomas broke the optics rules, and then once that came out of, and I, as a trans person, recognized like this was no longer going to be defensible when women who had the physical attributes of men, despite being on hormones, it was going to pose an optical and a political problem for the trans community.
And I would say for me, optics are less important than, someone can transition well and, have a feminized looking face. But in athletics, that doesn't make the person shorter. It doesn't make their heart smaller, their lungs smaller. It doesn't reduce the number of fast twitch fibers that they have. It doesn't widen their hips.
Yeah.
It doesn't change the issue. And I was also going to mention that nobody is talking about trans men. A trans man not on testosterone, because the women can't take testosterone either, is not a problem on a woman's team. It would be the testosterone use or someone being male, but it's not the trans issue.
Yeah.
I think calling it a trans issue deflects from what the actual concern is.
Yeah.
Is not transness, but the sex of the body.
Yeah. And also back in 2022, the science as it stood had yet, the thinking at that point, which I'll admit now, is highly likely to be incorrect, was that if someone who was trans was on a sufficient amount of hormones for a sufficiently long period of time to suppress their testosterone below a certain level, that whatever competitive advantage they may have from having gone through that puberty, like the height, the frame, the hips, all the kind of things you mentioned, was going to be offset by the negative effects of estrogen on athletic performance, things like the drop in your hemoglobin, the loss of your oxygen carrying capacity, whatever weakening of your muscles takes place. And so the thinking was, or the hope was that this was a wash. And the research that had been done at the time did not disprove that, but mostly because the research was very preliminary. And one of the mistakes the trans community made, and we can talk about this writ large over and over again in a lot of different areas, is they took some very preliminary evidence that was suggestive of, well, this isn't such a big deal, and decided that the science was settled and that this didn't really need to be looked into anymore because, hey, we've got these studies that show that your competitive advantage drops for people on a sufficiently long period of estrogen. And as someone who's gone through that process, I can say that yes, it does. Like I remember what it was like to be an athlete when I was male-bodied. I know what it was like to be an athlete female-bodied, and it was a very different experience in terms of my capacity to, let's say, jump to a certain height or run at a certain speed or have a certain amount of stamina. Like those things were things I noticed within my body when I transitioned. but I still retained some of those attributes. Like, I didn't stop being, I talked about this before in my other podcast. When you're a 5, 8.5 male playing basketball against people who are 6'1", 6'2", it's you have to have a certain level of skill to overcome that. When you're a 5'8" female, even if you're a little bit weaker, but the people guarding you are all 5'3" and 5'4", it's a very different kind of situation. Even though I may not be able to like jump and touch the rim anymore, as an example. So we all know these things happen, but what really turned this for me was just noticing how many times sort of average, people who were reasonable athletes, let's say even athletes like myself, were going into not necessarily Olympic level women's sports or even professional like or semi-pro level women's sports, but in sort of regional competitions, were then going in and taking, winning competitions and often gloating about competition, their wins in the setting of these. And you're like, okay, well, if this isn't a thing, why are we seeing so much of this? Like just empirically. Even if you're not necessarily making the Olympics, and even if you're not necessarily playing in the WNBA, why are we seeing this so often?
And why do we not see an equal number of trans men? I mean, right now, females transition to male at a much higher rate than males to female. Why do we not see the same percentage or more of trans men in men's sports?
Yeah. So
if it's just a hormonal difference that matters.
So I found this empiric evidence fairly convincing, even though it was not convenient data for me. Obviously, my preferred scientific answer would have been, if to be that yes, you're disadvantaged, and the loss of your hemoglobin and the loss of your stamina offsets any advantage you might get from, that we used to say, well, now you've got this like underpowered engine dragging around this big body, which is true, but it's just not enough to offset those advantages. Because you're right, we weren't seeing this happening in trans men. And when people would say something like, well, how come we're not seeing trans women winning at the Olympics? It's simply because if you like, the way I would describe it is, in order to be like the number one woman in the world, you have to probably be like a top 500 male. And you can be, let's say, a top 2,000 male, and you might make like top 50 female and I would say, like, if you look at the top 400 of any sort of any sport where strength matters or where height matters, if you took any of those 400 and transitioned them to female, they are going to be a strongly competitive female player. But the reason we're not seeing someone in the WNBA is, of those 400 people who potentially could win a WNBA championship or win a gold medal in track at the Olympics, probably none of them happen to be trans. And if they were trans, if I was I'm just saying, if I was so athletic that I was, let's say, a top 400 sprinter or a top 400 tennis player or a top 400 soccer player, even if I felt dysphoric, I'd probably put it off. I'd be like, I'm going to ride this. I'm going to see if I can ride this. I'm going to focus on my athletics, or even if I felt I needed to transition, I'm going to retire. I'm going to retire. So that the reason we're not seeing people in the Olympics is because that the pool from which those potential Olympic winning champions are drawn from are not going to either are not going to be trans or not going to transition, even if they are.
You had mentioned something that I brought up a thought for me. And that was, you're talking about the disadvantage that trans women face when they suppress testosterone and take estradiol. There is a societal concept that isn't spoken about out loud that often. And that idea is that women are actually failed or weak men, like we're lesser men, but we're not castrated males. We are not sexually immature males, like in the case of trans girl athletes who have had their puberty completely suppressed. We are actually our own beings, and we have our own anatomical and physiological female-specific traits that impact our ability in sports. Like the width of our hips and the Q angle is a huge thing. We are built like that because we're built to carry and deliver babies, whether we do or not. And suppressing puberty and then giving estradiol and the such does not create female hips on a male body.
If they're given early enough, they will.
I don't believe that.
Yeah.
I don't have proof, but I've never seen any evidence that they actually develop, that the skeleton then develops on a female trajectory.
Yeah. I'll look this up after, or you can even look it up and edit. But I think those changes primarily take place in terms of the widening of the hip and the flattening of the pelvic bones. That type of remodeling generally takes place fairly early in puberty. So the reason you might not see it as much is maybe more that a lot of the people who might stand out as like early transitioners were probably people who got puberty blocked at 15 or 16, when a lot of these changes, like a lot of the bony changes, um, have probably already mostly been completed. So like like when you think of how many girls or how boys and girls develop, a lot of the bone changes have already taken place by the time you're 15 or 16. Whereas if someone was puberty blocked, let's say right from 10 or 2, they're more likely to develop those types of physical changes. But obviously, your mileage may vary, and genetics and all those kind of things. But
Right. We'll
what I
have
think
to
is more
look that up.
important, yeah, what I think is probably more important is things like, no matter how early you transition, you're not managing a menstrual cycle. You're not, and whatever imposition or distraction that takes away from one's competitiveness. I think that's valid. But I'm going to come back to to the prepubescent thing, because I always think it's important about like where I think was a failure of the trans community. And I recognize different people in the trans community think different about this, because sports became this linchpin issue, and there were some trans people who were kind of like, even when they acknowledged that yes, there might be some competitive advantages, we're kind of saying we need to keep fighting this, because if we lose on sports, that's the first. It basically is a declaration of saying you are not actually women, and for many trans women, being female is an important part of or identifying and truly believing you're female is an important part of the experience. That if you give in on this, there's often this cartoon of the dominoes falling, and sports was always that first domino. That if you give in on sports, that everything else is going to follow, because you're basically saying you're not a real woman here. Well, then you're not going to be a real woman for washrooms. You're not going to be a real woman for other aspects of legal recognition. You're not going to be a legal woman when it comes to access to hormones. You're not going to be able to be a legal woman when it comes to being recognized as one in your job, etc. And then there are other people who are more sort of realists, which is where I put myself, which is kind of like, this is not a winning battle. We shouldn't be talking about sports. We should just admit that yes, we have some advantages. It creates it creates a legitimate imbalance in competition, and that at least when it comes to things that matter, and for me, those things that matter are scholarships, major awards, major trophies, popular acclaim. Those kind of things matter enough that we should not be having this fight. That it looks bad on us every time. I made a quip one time that was not very popular among trans people, that if we're trying to convince the public that we are not men, which I think many trans people are trying to do. I don't agree that I'm a man, but one way to quickly dispel that rumor is to show a trans woman who looks masculine dominating women at sports. The optics of that look bad. When people see that, they're going to be like, that person is clearly not a woman. So why should I consider any trans woman a woman? And so I and many other trans people actually were advocating more from a strategic retreat on sports, saying like, we just shouldn't be talking about this. We shouldn't be trying to make this case. Let's focus on the things that matter to us, which are things like legal recognition, access to therapy, non-discrimination, etc. So, and I think our insistence of our most potent advocates really set us back in a lot of ways, because we got so focused on this issue that we kind of took our eye off the prize on things that to me matter a lot more.
Yeah, and I agree there that it is problematic. It does cause a lot of problems, even though people, trans women in particular, might not really care for the concept. But when people are saying that there is no difference between trans women and women, that erases women. I think conceding that yes, there are some differences allows more room for openness, and allows more space for women where that difference matters.
Yeah.
That sex difference. And I do know that some trans women say yes, their sex has actually changed. I don't believe that sex changes. Appearance changes.
Yeah.
Lifestyle changes. How people are perceived can be changed, but sex itself doesn't change.
Yeah, like, I know it's sort of very, very few trans people will actually say that their chromosomes change. I'm of the opinion, I know becomes a bit of a side conversation, that there are enough things that change about your physiology that it becomes more female, regardless of your chromosomes, that it makes more sense to be legally treated as female, or to even in a health context, and we can talk about this maybe in another episode, my health risks, because I've been an estrogen for 25 years, probably more closely mirror the risks of women. Like in terms of things like my breast cancer risk, it's much more closer to that of a woman than it is to that of a man. My cardiovascular risk is probably much closer to the risk of a woman than it is to a man, and my risk for autoimmune disease, like all those kind of things are, now, we can get into the semantics of does that make me a woman? You would say no. I would say it makes me, I would say, yeah, sex is binary at birth, but given hormones, we can make things pretty dang close. But, I know that's a side conversation, but the point is that these, regardless of how much hormones they take, my chromosomes don't change, and regardless of how long I take hormones for, there's certain parts of my anatomy that don't change. No matter how long I take hormones, there's certain consequences that going through male puberty and being born XY is going to have on my competitive advantages, and I just have to acknowledge those. Now, I'm also of the opinion that I don't think that should necessarily preclude trans women or trans men from participating in sports that are separated by gender when it comes to things like recreation, and where it comes to things like where the primary purpose of the sporting event is camaraderie. Or
when you say gender, do you mean sex or do you mean self-concept?
I mean that I've played on women's teams that are part of leagues that are explicitly open to participation on the basis of gender identity. Okay. Now, whether they're stated so explicitly, these are the kind of things that I think can be more handled individually. So for me, when I played sports on women's teams, it was for me an opportunity to do fun things and competitive things and build bonds between myself and other women who some of them who were my friends going in and who asked me to come join their team, and some of them who became my friends over time as we played for a decade together. And in my case, because I'm, I can recognize this is not just about being trans, because I'm small-bodied and not terribly physically imposing, that I personally didn't pose a safety risk, even though I recognize that some trans women and perhaps even some natal women might pose a safety risk. Like we did also play with a girl who was a bit of a steamroller and took a lot of
that steamroller is still not as strong as an athletic male, and the Peyton McNabb event points to that.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, on an individual level, this woman was stronger than me, and I recognize that a male of that size at that speed is doing a lot more damage. But what I'm saying is,
and women's skulls are thinner and our bones are thinner.
Yeah, well, mine are super thin now.
There's age too.
Yeah, age, and then all the kind of things we do to ourselves.
So yeah.
So so like the point is, and this may come into as we get into the Supreme Court cases about sort of across the table bans versus versus sort of more specific bans on issues like, can we keep women safe by preventing certain kinds of people from participating, as opposed to, preventing all women participating? Because, when I'm talking about non-competitive recreational sport, safety obviously is consideration. You don't want any player playing unsafely. And obviously people have certain body types have the potential, when they play unsafely, to do more damage to other people than someone who is of a different body type. And I think this is
male is a very specific body type.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're suggesting here is that an athlete who is applying to a woman's team has to have a whole bunch of aspects tested specifically to see if they fall in whatever pre-approved range. And so then it does become individual and essentially personal. That is then discrimination.
But it already is personal on some levels, because there's when we play soccer, there's this element of self-policing, which is that people who play recklessly, or people who are get red cards and they get booted at a game.
That's behavioral.
Yeah.
And in the Peyton McNabb case, spiking a ball hard, the trans woman athlete did, that is a normal volleyball behavior. Yes. That's not tackling the other team. That's not a red flag thing. But the collision there was that the trans woman is much bigger. Even I'm assuming there's some kind of hormonal something going on.
Yeah. So
that person still had the strength and the thinness of women's. Permanently injured. Yeah. Peyton McNabb. Women don't go around, causing each other brain damage in volleyball because we don't have the strength. We're not male-bodied.
See, I would argue that, first of all, that there are a lot of women hurting each other playing women's volleyball, and that concussions
to that extent, permanent brain damage.
I don't want to get into the specifics because I recognize this is sort of an actively debated issue, and I don't have the objective measurements of the extent of Peyton McNabb's brain damage. But in terms of like, do those types of injuries take place on volleyball courts across the country that where women play women? Yes. Did this woman, the trans woman, did she hit that ball exceptionally hard for a woman? Yes. Are there other elite women athletes who can hit as hard as her? Probably.
Not,
Yeah,
that's,
I know we're getting into speculation, but like I'm saying,
yeah.
You can make like the two arguments, and like I said, this is separate from the issue of because I don't think that girl should have been playing because she had unfair competitive advantages, which is I think a totally different issue. That she had because she had some exposure to male puberty, she had advantages that any other woman could only get if she had been doping, and we don't allow doping, and so we shouldn't allow this kind of doping either. Like that's my on competitive sports, but the two sort of comparables would be, first of all, women and men play on co-ed teams. And while on those teams, you could say, well, the men maybe lay off a little bit, and when they see they're hitting at a woman, that they maybe don't hit 100% of their strength. But that, once again, is discretionary. Sometimes you play with an asshole, or sometimes you play with someone who doesn't know their own strength, and that happens in co-ed. And then the second part of it is that if there was a woman who was a natal woman, but just happened to be a super athlete, like Caitlin Clark level elitism. We see this all the time in like male sports. Like sometimes, they talk like if you happen to play on the high school team where LeBron James was your competition, like LeBron, like that level of athleticism is almost like another species, and he's playing against kids who are going to be like teachers and accountants, and and we let him play, and he has, I'm sure as an 11th grader had what may as well have been superhero level strength and superhero level talent, but we don't say you can't play because you can hurt people here. We expect those boys
right, but he was playing other males.
He was, but in terms of like the difference between that volleyball girl and her competition, and the difference between, let's say, an elite, like the kind of girl who's going to go on to become an all-collegiate all-star, who's going to spike from the top row, that girl probably hits as hard as this mid-level, this girl in North Carolina. She was a good athlete. She may have gone on to get a scholarship, but she was not like a top-line athlete. And it's conceivable that someone like Peyton McNabb would have had, maybe if she was going to the next week she was playing the state champions, there's a good chance there was a natal girl who could smash that ball just as hard as this trans girl did.
Yeah, I mean that's all speculation. I'm making I don't agree with you eyebrows.
That's fine. I think that's what the show is about. I don't agree
right.
Either.
And I also think of Fallon Fox, that MMA fighter who cracked the skull of their opponent, in a minute or less.
Yeah. No, like there's something clearly like, I don't want to put myself out on this limb of like that there are no advantages. And I think especially in battle sports like that, like where you're actually, where punching, or you're putting physical specimen directly on physical specimen. Yeah. I think that, like I said, I'm not going to argue something that's inarguable. But I do think there is still a place, where sports are primarily for camaraderie and team building and peer building exercises, because I want to believe, I think trans women do better in society and become less like basket cases and make a more positive contribution to society when they know how to behave and when they form relationships and friendships with non-trans girls and non-trans women. And I'm not saying it's the job of non-trans women to make that their responsibility to educate, but trans women who actually want to succeed as women in the world do that, are the ones who are able to form pro-social relationships with other women. And one of the ways we do this is through team building. And one of the ways that women and men team build is through sports. And like I said, this was an invaluable experience for me. And I didn't look at it like I didn't make it these responsibility for these women to teach me how to be a girl. It was more just like I'm a woman. I feel like a woman. I want to have, I'm looking to make female friends, just like a lot of women who joined the team were. Like a lot of women joined the team who were new to town and they wanted to meet female friends. What's a quick way of doing it? I'm going to join the soccer team. And
sure. And in a community sport league or whatever.
That's what this was.
Like, and that makes sense to me. I used to participate. We had this wonderful outdoor sportsplex. Participate in the co-ed volleyball teams. Yeah. And the thing was, as you even get 2 or 3 weeks in, if so many women drop out.
Yeah.
That I became, my team dissolved and I could just show up and be a female player for anyone.
Yeah. No, like I played.
And that's, that's great fun. And I believe that if a league is designed, like it's not elite competition, like there's always some kind of competition, but fun leagues are fun leagues. If that's their design, that it's either co-ed or they say that the women's team includes trans women, I think that's great. But and to get back to these cases, we're talking about the 14th Amendment and Title IX, where things are receiving, programs are receiving government funding.
Yeah.
So, and the actual original purpose of Title IX, because BPJ 60 years ago could have, played on a team too. But if BPJ were female, they wouldn't have been able to participate in school sports because the girls' teams frequently didn't exist.
So I think this is maybe a good transition to talking about the actual meat of these cases, and I know we've been talking about sport because sport is, obviously it's an interesting topic. Even though, like I said, I'm probably one of the less popular people in the trans community for being kind of like let's stop talking about sports or let's stop trying to compete at high level sports. That I still believe there's some places and these cases actually highlight a few of the places where I think there may be some wiggle room.
Or don't compete with women. Like you can compete. There's a male category, and I understand that might be distasteful, but no one is banning anyone from sports altogether.
Yeah. So I think that's, I get what you're saying. Like no one is banning you from, like, you're right. Any trans woman has the right to compete with men in sports. But what this goes down to is the reasons of why do people, not just men and women, but why do people in general want to participate in sports? And for some people, it's because they're trying to do their best and beat whatever version of themselves and become sort of the best. For some people, it is the competition and wanting to be better than the competition. And for others, it is a way to, it's an activity to do things with friends and peers.
But Title IX isn't social.
Yeah, but we'll come back to Title IX, but I'm just talking about the motivations of why. So when you tell someone like me that, like, don't play with the girls, even though like all your friends are women and women are asking you to be on the team because whatever, the three women from work are looking at they don't know your past, or even they don't care about your past. They're just like, well, you're tall and you're fun. We like you look like you might like to play soccer, and it's like, okay, I'll play soccer. Something to do on a Tuesday night. That is a very different motivation than I want to dominate this sport. But when we come back,
right? But we're not talking about fun leagues. These things.
This isn't fun. Yeah, I know I'm talking about fun leagues because at some point, if someone says, "Well, you're tall, and we want you to play on our semi-professional basketball team that plays for actual money," it wouldn't be right. I'd have to say, you know what? Like, I've been doping, basically, and as a result, even though I'd love to play with you, it gives me an advantage that none of you would have had unless you were also doping. So unless this league allows doping, I probably shouldn't play with you. That's a totally different thing than, hey, a bunch of us play Tuesday night soccer down at the community center.
Sure.
Want to come join us, and then we'll all go out for beers after, and hang out with the girls, which is basically what my league was. But coming back to Title IX, because I think this touches on fairly serious issues, because these are both in the context, one is of high school athletics, and I think one is in the course of college athletics. College athletics. And so these are interesting cases, and I know we've been talking about sport the whole time, but what I find actually more interesting about these cases is the non-sport aspects of it, and how sport is going to be used as a vehicle that may either, depending on how the Supreme Court rules, may either open the door to much broader trans freedoms, or may completely close the door on trans freedoms, or if you want to look at it from Yvette's perspective.
Right. From my perspective, it would be, what does this do to the definition of sex? Because if sex gets changed out with gender identity or even legal sex, then this subverts things like Title IX, and it subverts every single protection or anything that is specifically for women.
Yeah. So I know we're both constitutional scholars, and so we all know. We both picked up our constitutional scholarship certificate over mail order this week, and
right, mine's in crayon.
And after this, I'm going to be taking a plane down to Washington, and I will be petitioning before the Supreme Court this week. So this is a very important Supreme Court case this week, as Yvette mentioned earlier in the podcast, and it's actually two cases that are both being heard at the same time. And so for any of our viewers, I know obviously a lot of our viewership is really engaged in trans issues, but for anyone who's just sort of happening upon this, or maybe isn't aware of all the details. These are basically two cases. One is a case called Hecox versus Little. But Hecox is
the other way around.
Is it the other way around?
Yeah, the state one was Hecox versus Little, and the federal one is Little versus
Okay, so
Hecox.
Little versus Hecox. Okay, which is basically so the background of the story is that Hecox. I'm just gonna get her first name here, Lindsay Hecox.
Lindsay.
Yeah, Lindsay Hecox was a trans woman who transitioned, I believe, late in high school and was going to University in Idaho, I believe, to Boise State University, and was trying out for a collegiate women's track team. She didn't end up making the team, but she was trying out for the team. And at around that same time, Idaho passed a law basically saying that that any college or school that receives any funding from the state has to cannot allow trans people to play on sports teams of their gender, but that sports should be defined according to their biological sex, which was basically sex as observed at birth or chromosomal sex, and also put in a series of stipulations on which the state could use to test who actually was XX and who actually was XY. And so Lindsay basically sued the state, and the initial ruling of the Fourth Circuit, or the Ninth Circuit, I should say, was that because Lindsay was considered to be female under the eyes of the law, that she had the right to be on this team, and the law was basically the Idaho law was basically put in suspension. It was determined to be unenforceable. To which the Idaho Attorney General took the case to the Supreme Court. Now, in the meantime, Hecox has decided she doesn't want to pursue the case because she's no longer in college athletics. She, I think, also doesn't want this publicity associated with her name, and actually asked to get this case removed. But the Supreme Court decided they were, at least for now, going to go ahead with it anyways because there's an important legal principle at play. I'm going to repeat that. So the Idaho case basically focuses on the Equal Protection Clause, which is part of which is basically part of the 14th Amendment, which basically states that it's not just about sex, but it basically says that any state that passes a law that potentially has a negative impact on a protected class of individual, which can include things like can include things like sex, can include things like race, can include nationality, and other sort of classes of groups of people where we have a history of discriminating against. Oh, you're shaking your head?
No, yeah, because I wrote down. It says the Equal Protection Clause is, quote, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the U.S., nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So it doesn't specifically talk about protected classes.
Okay, so obviously I need to get my constitution. I need to go back to these people who sold me this constitutional law degree and tell them that
unless that means unless privileges and immunities point to protected classes.
Yeah.
That I don't know, but this would have been written up quite shortly after the Civil War.
Yeah. So obviously, when people were writing when the states were putting forth amendments to the Constitution back in the 1870s, in the aftermath of the Civil War, they weren't thinking about these specific issues. But the way this has basically been applied is, as Yvette was saying, that because all citizens are deserving of equal protection and equal rights under the law, of when states or when legislatures pass laws that might have disproportionate effects on citizens, and when it does so on the basis of certain characteristics, that those laws are subject to some level of scrutiny by the courts to determine if they are actually constitutional. And so what is basically being challenged is Idaho's law that allows the schools to discriminate on the basis of biologic sex. Does this leave someone like Hecox, does this violate the 14th Amendment in terms of not allow, in terms of depriving Hecox of certain privileges that she is due, or certain rights that she is due?
Right. And in the Hecox case, they're also talking about Title IX, but Title IX creates a remedial protection class that the women's category exists because of women's overall physical disadvantage as compared to males in sports. So that would be a legal discrimination looking at Title IX in that way.
Yeah. So these are, I guess, the competing views here, which is does the state, in terms of Title IX, basically, just to go back to the history of Title IX, this was basically created in a time where women did not have, at least when it came to athletics and academic opportunities, that women, and there's no argument from anyone here, that women did not have the same opportunities that men had. And this included things like, I know today we're talking about sports competitions, but it also included things like access to housing on campus. It included things like access to scholarships, access, and especially in the context of athletics, where a lot of scholarships were given to boys on the basis of their athletic ability, but those scholarships were not available to girls on the basis of their athletic ability. That boys had this systemic advantage in terms of being able to access these scholarships and access ways into college and higher education and wealth that women didn't have. And also just in terms of the competition, that there were that many sports had men's leagues, but women who played those same sports did not have the opportunity to participate and to get the support of their universities or even their high schools to have these to have these opportunities. And the issue of of men and women being physically different, of course, we all recognize this, and that's the reason why, even though there were men's teams, it wasn't feasible for women just to participate on those men's teams and have the opportunities, because even if women were allowed, let's say, or were open to participate on a men's basketball team, a men's football team, a men's baseball team, they're not going to be the ones who are winning the scholarships for the top players in those leagues because of these obvious physical changes that are, brought on by some combination of body plan and pubertal hormones. It was never going to be a fair competition, no matter how talented a woman was. So I think,
and it would also interfere with, let's say on a typical football team, there's usually not always a male coach, but the players are all male.
Yeah.
And to put females on the team changes the culture and changes like how playing on the football team functions in those young men's lives. And I'm thinking more college and football. My dear friend has been a high school football coach and a Notre Dame football coach.
Yeah.
And so it's more than just football. It's also men teaching boys how to be men.
Yeah, that's true. And I could come back to you with the argument of like, well, what would it be like to throw a trans woman in there? But on the basis of sex. But it's I'm sure, like I would have to think that most trans women, if they're anything like me, would be fairly disruptive to have them in the locker room as well. But that's that's a separate thing from the Supreme Court case. So the issue at play here is that the state is basically saying that that having this law does not violate Hecox's right, because Hecox, being biologically male, still has opportunities to play on the male teams. It's not as though they're being cut out from sports entirely. They have the opportunity to play on the boys' team and race on the boys' track team and to be competitive for scholarships among the other boys. Whereas Hecox and her legal team is basically arguing that because under the law, Hecox is, even though biologically we can say she's biologically male or natally male, under the law she is considered female, that she is being denied an opportunity that other women, legal females who happen to be XX, have access to, that she is being denied opportunity to this, and therefore it's discriminating. So that's the basic contours of the argument. And the interesting thing is the case really isn't about, is not definitely about competitive advantage. It's just, does the state have the right to put this law in that discriminates against this person on the basis of biologic sex, versus are they discriminating her as just being a different kind of female? Is she being discriminated against? So that's the case, and obviously we have different opinions on where that should land, but that's the basic outlines of the case. And
right, I mean, the discrimination on the basis of sex is that a male student doesn't qualify for the female team. I mean, I don't know that would be an illegal discrimination.
Yeah, but I guess they would say that a male student has the opportunity to play among their peers and has the opportunity, whereas someone who is female has the opportunity generally to play among their peers, unless they are a legal female who happens to be trans, in which case they don't if this law is allowed to stand. And therefore, if you believe the side of the defendants of Hecox and her legal team, she's being discriminated against. And if you believe the arguments of Little and the state's legal team, you would say that she's not being discriminated against, and that's what the nine wise men and women in robes are going to decide. But yeah, and so the decision comes to, like, for women, would come down to, what is it to be female? Is being female, is that a sex, or is that a legal designation? Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
And that's for women, that's a very big deal.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's a big deal too, because I argue in legal contexts that even though I'm natally male, that there is some set threshold, and we can argue about what that is because I think that's a whole other show. About when does that become enough that you can justify or rationalize a legal change of sex. And for me, like I said, I have a legal change of sex. It doesn't mean that I was born female. It just means that under the eyes of the law, given what I've done or given who I am, that I should have some legal recognition. There should be some legal recognition under the laws as being seen as female. And I know this
Sure, but
this gets into
yeah,
things about
right.
Yeah.
Sure, but like in New Mexico, if you want to change your sex, you fill out a form and get it notarized.
Yeah.
And so that would allow any man who, for whatever reason, wants to become legally female. And then, if the defendants prevail in these cases, then that person is legally female and has full access to like use Title IX to compete on women's teams.
Yeah, which is
legally.
Yeah, which is the status quo right now. Now, even as a trans person, I don't like that. And I don't like that because I think it also makes a mockery out of what I've done. So when I see cases like, there's one in Alberta where someone changed their legal sex for the purpose of saving $1,100 on their insurance, on their car insurance, because women, because they're actuarially less likely to get into accidents and less likely to get into accidents that cause major damage, they get lower insurance rates on their vehicles. Now, that's a farce. That's a mockery. And it's a mockery too when, there was a person who wasn't trans but was trying to prove a point, who changed his sex legally to female and then competed in a weightlifting competition and won it. Like I'm saying, like that makes a mockery not just of women, but it makes a mockery of trans women as well. But what I would say is, like, it's commonly said that the law is an ass. And that if the Supreme Court, not that I think they're going to just because of the make of the Supreme Court, but let's say the Supreme Court was to rule in a very trans-positive way, and say that Idaho fails and Idaho's law fails to subjects Hecox to a violation of the Equal Protections Clause, and they decide that, okay, we cannot discriminate against trans women who want to participate in sports, I think then it's up to the legislature of Idaho, which they're probably already on their way of doing if they haven't already, to sort of say, well, this is what a legal woman is and this is what a legal woman isn't. And if they want to define a legal woman as being biological sex or comedic sex or however you want to define it, that's totally within the Idaho's legislature's bailiwick to do that. And if Washington State next door decides that they want to define women as New Mexico does, then that's their prerogative and that's the will of their voters as well. And if they wanted to find it somewhere in between, which is kind of what I favor, that also would be their prerogative. So what I worry about, though, and this has to do with the BPJ case, so maybe just tell our listeners about BPJ. What are the issues at play there?
Basically, BPJ is a young male who started socially transitioning to female, I think at 8.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
Has had full puberty suppression, and was competing on the girls' track team. And I don't know as many details as you did about the other, but then this person wasn't allowed to compete anymore because they're male. Now, I did listen to a podcast yesterday with Chase Strangio, who for the ACLU will be speaking on behalf of the defendants in these cases. And Strangio made, this comment that I've heard before when justifying essentially anyone who wants to play on the girls' team to be on the girls' team, that BPJ is actually not a very good athlete. So why does it matter to anyone? Why should BPJ be excluded from the female team? Because they're not going to win anyway, which I think is a pretty pathetic argument.
I don't think it's a great legal argument. Even if it's true, like he's right in the sense that just because you're male does not automatically mean you're going to be a dominant female athlete, because some men really suck at sports. And
right, but that's not what women's sports is for.
Yeah,
it's not for it's not for males who are not good athletes.
Sorry,
it's not for sexually immature males, because with puberty suppression and then cross-sex hormones, they remain sexually immature.
What I would argue, and this is, once again, I know this isn't what's really being ruled on for the Supreme Court, is that, and this is sort of, as I said in a little intro, is that girls' sports are for people who are girls. And by my definition, and I know it's not the definition you share, is that someone who is a social girl, so if I look at the case of BPJ, so like you're saying, BPJ was 8 when she started transitioning. I believe this case started when she was 12, and I think she's 15 now. And similarly to the law in Idaho, the law in West Virginia, which was, I think, similarly structured, has been placed on hold until the ruling of the Supreme Court. So right now, BPJ is playing on the sports team ostensibly, or at least at last report, with girls. And setting competitive advantages aside, because I know it gets a little more complicated in terms of because her puberty is suppressed, in terms of what degree of advantage does she or does she not have on the basis of not going through male puberty. But the point is that, from my perspective, is that every child in that high school should have the opportunity to play a sport. And the reason we give kids opportunities to play sports is not just about winning, it's about and I think in high school, especially for most of those kids, because most kids who play high school sports are not going to get scholarships. Most of them are not going to become pro. At best, most of them might play in a recreational league when they're older. The primary purpose of sports in high school is camaraderie building exercises and peer-to-peer relationship building. And if someone is socially female, and this is, I think, where it becomes tricky because, where is are they being disadvantaged if you tell someone like, now I don't want to get into the specific BPJ because I know there's a lot of baggage around and there's a lot of sort of unsubstantiated discussion about conversations that took place in the locker room. But setting that aside, because I recognize that these are just allegations at this point, does a child like BPJ, even if not necessarily BPJ herself, does a child who is in BPJ's situation, is a boy's and who we believe should have the access to play on a team, is the best place for BPJ on the male team, not just for herself, but for whatever impact it's going to have on all the other boys on the team, like you kind of alluded to earlier, or is the best place for her on the girls' team, not only once again for the impact it's going to have on herself, but on her teammates. Now, I know this is hard because I played on teams, and it's not just about sex. Sometimes you have a really disruptive teammate who kind of ruins the vibe, regardless of gender, because they are, just that kind of person. And sometimes you have someone who, in this case, happens to be trans, who joins a team who really adds to the team because they have personality aspects or just
Well, and on a team where, it's really not about skills and it's really about pillow fights and pajama parties, that's whatever. But another thing that then like kind of who cares?
Yeah.
But another thing that we're ignoring is that every time or frequently when we make a choice, like a big choice in our lives, some doors open and other doors close.
Yeah.
BPJ, as a minor, cannot consent.
Yeah.
So BPJ's parent, and I don't want to pick on this person. I'm just using BPJ.
BPJ's parents made a decision that they believed, rightly or wrongly, was in the best interest of her health to
right.
Her young age.
Yeah, they chose to transition BPJ, and that closes some doors. Yeah. And sometimes if it's more important to transition than to play on a same-sex team, then okay, that's a choice. Choices have consequences. And I'm sure they weren't thinking about, I don't think, this person's parents were thinking about what doors does this close for my child when we do this. But it's not up to the girls to absorb. It's not their job to absorb males who need to transition. Yeah. Now, interpersonally, they may all be great friends. I'm not saying that, but it's not. And this is like an old cultural thing that it's up to the women and the girls to accommodate the males all the time, and put the males' desires and needs above their own.
Yeah. So I frame this differently, and I think part of it, because the way that trans people and trans minors are often talked about, is that they are viewed as an imposition, or the assumption is they're always going to be an imposition. And I think that's not a framing that I think is healthy for me, in terms of, because people are people, and some, there's individuals who can be in positions. There's people who actually can be, whatever the opposite of position, like actual creators, like people who actually make the room better. And those people sometimes might be born male. And it doesn't become the job of, I don't frame this as it's the job of women to take in like this edge case, like taking in an orphan or taking in someone off the street. This is our job to fix. This is just like, here's a teammate, and we are going to treat this person like a teammate, regardless of their background, whether they came from being male or being female, whether they came from that part of the world or this part of the world, whether they came from a rich family or a poor family, whether they have been having mental health struggles or don't have mental health struggles. It's not like their job to take this person on. This is just a teammate, and we all.
But this is sex-based, and I would, like, given the points you're bringing up,
but I'd say
let's have, but it's sex-based. Let's have more co-ed teams for kids.
But we have co-ed teams. I mean, maybe not necessarily for kids, But we all know that co-ed teams serve a very different role than sex-separated teams. That is not just about about maintaining competitive fairness. Like sex specific, or which for the most part translates into gender specific. Outside, if you take trans people out of the picture, um, the reason we have sex/gender specific sports is not just about competitive fairness. It is at some level, but it's also about camaraderie, peer-to-peer relationships, team building, friendship making, those types of things. And so the case before the court is for someone like BPJ, who has been socialized female now for as long as she's been socialized male. She is legally female. Does by saying she cannot go on that team, does it place her at once again, this is for the court to decide, is she being denied an opportunity that other girls would have? And in doing so, is she either missing out on a benefit or being exposed to harm? And if the court decides both those two things are true, then it really doesn't matter what the state's interest was. That's considered to be a Title IX violation. And so that's really, and obviously I'm not a Supreme Court justice, but that's what the court deciding is, does this disadvantage her inability to participate on a women's team? Is that a disadvantage? You're saying it's not because there's other teams available, or that
there's other teams and there are other social contexts.
Yeah, and
there are other ways.
There are other ways she can make friends. She can join
club,
she can join the school newspaper, she can do other things. But none of those are sex segregated. There may be some that are de facto sex segregated, like I don't know if they have like a knitting circle, which might end up being de facto sex segregated, but I doubt those things really exist. And then the other part of the part that I'm actually more worried about is about the equal protection is because the court, as we all know, skews conservative, and the court, at least on cultural issues, not just pertaining to trans issues, but pertaining to conservative issues, whether it's around guns, whether it's around religion, has tended to rule in a fairly consistent 6-3 manner, maybe 5-4 or some, but fairly, but in favor of those principles. And I think it's likely, however, I don't know how they're going to get there. Like that's up to them and their clerks to decide. Is that they likely will rule against the trans defendants, just on the basis of historical patterns and the makeup of the court. Like, it might surprise me because every so often the Supreme Court does, but that is what I think is going to be the likely outcome.
Right, and also with the what we saw with the Scarametti case, for which Chase Strangio also argued in that case, and Scarametti prevailed.
Yeah, and Scarametti.
So yeah.
But
why this is important to me is like how this is decided can impact what it means to be female in the law.
Yeah.
Is it a declaration? But like in my state, it's a declaration.
Yeah.
It's just stating on paper, I'm female. You can take a child and change their birth certificate, the sex on their birth certificate, at will.
Yeah.
Like you don't even need no medical history, no nothing. Yeah. You and just do it at will. Yeah. And I like, how does this benefit or hurt women?
Yeah, no, I agree. And like I said, I would work with you or anyone to sort of say we need to, like, I hope that blue states like New Mexico or even like places like I live, like Ontario, develop some common sense on this. Because I don't believe, while I believe self-ID laws were put in place with good intent, or at least if you want to put the least favorable thing on it, without really much forethought in terms of what the downstream impacts on women were going to be, it's fairly clear at this point that self-ID laws are both damaging to women and to trans women.
Yes.
Or at least trans women like myself who are trying to integrate. I know I said earlier in the podcast that I think a lot of these examples make a mockery of what it means to be trans, and I think a lot of the gender criticals use that as a weapon, and not inappropriately so, against trans people when they say, well, all being trans means I'm just if you're a man and you put on a dress, then you're trans just as much as I am, and that's insulting to someone like myself. But it's insulting because it is legally allowed, like the right. Someone can put on a dress and go to the court and swear a statement and say that. But what I'm more concerned about is when I think of what are the core protections that I think are important for trans people, and I think also what most Americans would agree, like maybe not everybody, is that people shouldn't be discriminated in the workplace on the basis of being trans. People shouldn't be discriminated in terms of their ability to obtain housing or housing subsidies on the basis of being trans. People shouldn't lose their jobs specifically because of being trans. People should have the right to access adults, at the very least, should have the right to make decisions about their body, even if you disagree with them, which could include hormonal and surgical manipulations to make someone look more female. Like, those are things that, regardless of what people think about sports, regardless of what people think about bathrooms, regardless of what people think about, self-ID or prisons, most Americans, definitely most Canadians, most Brits, still believe in those core things, and these are important.
I do too.
Yeah, and these are.
I agree with you.
Yeah. Now, if let's say the Supreme Court rules in a very decisive way, and says that being trans is not a characteristic that we have to consider under the Equal Protection Clause. That being trans, does not put you at a disadvantage, or that we can't even define what being trans is. And they say that we do not need to subject laws that seek to discriminate on trans status if we carve that out from sex, and say that you are your birth sex, but trans status is not a protected class. Then any state government or any federal government could then say, we want to discriminate. We want to keep trans people, let's say, from working for the state government. We'd like to keep.
Bostock already has set a precedent around that, where that case boiled down to it is illegal to discriminate against someone for being trans or homosexual, because that's considered discrimination on the basis of sex. That applies to employment, but that's already in there. Yeah, there's already precedent on that.
Yeah, so I guess two things. One, it wouldn't be the first time that the Supreme Court sort of looked at re-examined previous precedents and limited the applicability of this. We can see this in the classic one, obviously, is Roe versus Wade. So there is a chance they will use this as an opportunity to limit the interpretability or the applicability of Bostock. And if they do, it may leave trans people in the open when it comes to a law that is negatively predisposing against trans people to pass a law that says, because we're not just, because trans people are male, or trans women are male, and because trans men are female, that we're not discriminating on male or females, we're discriminating on trans status. And as long as the state can say we have a rational interest, and it doesn't have to stand with any scrutiny. It can just say, we believe that trans people are evil. We believe that trans people in the workplace are disruptive. We believe that trans.
Do you really think they're going to do that? That the point is trans people and not, hurting trans people rather than protecting women?
As a trans person, and listening to the kind of talk that happens among the legislature, and I recognize a lot of this is maybe attempts to move the Overton window, but right now, like I heard this week, and I'm not saying it's going to become law, but someone in the Utah Republican Party is proposing banning trans people from being physicians and banning trans people from being teachers, because
that's terrible.
Yeah, because it's potentially exposing them to children.
Yeah, I disagree with that there.
So obviously I disagree with that too, but all the state would need to do, if they passed that law and someone said, I don't like this law because it's discriminating against trans people, they would say, well, according to BPJ, trans status is not protective as long as the state states a rational interest. And that rational interest could be, we are protecting children. They don't have to prove that it actually does protect children. They don't have to show that it disadvantages trans people. All they have to do is say that we have a rational basis for this law, and the Supreme Court cannot subject it to heightened scrutiny. Because if trans people are protected, then in order for a state to pass a law and for it to pass constitutional muster, they have to show not just that it has a rational interest, but that it serves what they call a compelling interest, like this is timely and necessary. They have to show proof of how this law actually will accomplish that goal. They can't just say, well, we think it will. We have to actually show evidence to show that not doing the law will cause harm, and that doing the law will bring about a benefit. And they have to then also show that the group that they're discriminating against will not face disproportionate harm, or that they cannot accomplish the same goal with a much less restrictive set of laws. So that's why it's really important for trans people or trans status in some way to have some level of being a protected class, because if that is taken away, it opens the doors for legislatures, just like you correctly complain about legislatures passing stupid law, like self-ID, that puts women at a disadvantage and for me makes a mockery out of the true trans experience. Legislatures will also be free to pass bad law or stupid law that may seek to directly discriminate against trans people, just like the military.
But then they will also, and I totally oppose a law along those lines, and I hope that it receives the same lack of affirmation that I forgot who it was. They recently were proposing walking back gay marriage, and that just went over like a lead balloon. I hope this goes over like a lead balloon too, though it would create a precedent to define a trans person in law.
Yeah.
And to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, to my knowledge, there isn't a definition of a trans person in law.
Yeah. And I would favor some definition of what it means to be trans, because, like, I sound like a broken record here, is that there is, it's very easy for gender criticals who are, not, especially the ones who are more inherently, let's say, transphobic, not just gender critical, to kind of say, well, you're all the same. Like, if, that person, like I said, that person who puts on the dress, or the person who, that person in the Wii Spa who just says, well, I'm a woman, and then goes and, exposes her genitalia in the pool.
Or the Planet Fitness guy in the
Fitness
bathroom.
person, to say that person is the same as myself, or the thousands and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other trans people who are law-abiding citizens, who are gainfully employed, who love their families and are loved by their families, who, who are bringing positive, adding positive things, making discoveries in the lab, protecting the public, fighting in our wars, all the kind of things that trans people do across society that are good and that bring benefits to their communities and that add wealth to their communities. That is a very different thing than the person who is masturbating at Planet Fitness. And I would love to find some way to write that into the law so that gender criticals, or particularly the more aggressive gender criticals, can't continue to beat trans people like myself about, it's a huge Achilles heel that we've sort of left open, that as long as we have these very lax laws that allow anybody to declare themselves to be female, that it's going to be continued. They're going to use that law to pummel people like myself. And all I have to say is, like, I don't believe this. And they're like, well, your law does. Or all the trans community is going to hate you if you say something different. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, we need to fix this. So, prediction.
Yeah.
What is your prediction for the Supreme Court?
What is my prediction for the Supreme Court? Given where we are and Stormetti and other recent precedents, I think they're likely to find for the plaintiffs defining Title IX or supporting that sex is not legal but biological, how the body developed.
Yeah, and I think it's something similar. I think it's going to be either 5463, and I think it also is going to, what I'm hoping, I think my best, like, recognizing the make of the court, my best possible is that they lose on Title IX. I mean, that trans people kind of lose on Title IX and say that the states that a trans girl does, is not being denied an opportunity on the basis, even though, like I said, I personally disagree with it. But I do hope that they protect something being transitioning at the very least as a protected status, and that they identify that people who are gender variant, or people who are, or at least appear gender variant, have traditionally faced discrimination, have traditionally faced, done worse off in society, and that they are deserving of some degree of protection, so that any state that does seek to pass a law that might disadvantage the trans community, at the very least, will be subject to some level of scrutiny at the level of the court, is my hope.
Yeah, and I like that idea. Like, I could roll with that too, where it the way the judgment ends up being does not create an opportunity for literally anti-trans laws.
Yeah,
like that, like saying, okay, if you have transitioned or declare a trans identity, or you have an X or whatever on your driver's license, that you cannot be a teacher in this state, or you cannot. I don't want any limitation on rights or employment or housing based on trans status.
Yeah. And like I said,
and then they would just have to define what trans means. My worst fear for the potential outcome of this is that it changes the definition of sex to be a legal status and not a physical thing, because then that undermines any sex-based protection, accommodation, remediation. It's all undermined.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a very big deal for women.
Yeah. Whereas obviously I favor some legal status, but also with some conditions. Like, the fact is, like I said, I'm legally female, but I'm also legally female who had, 15 or 14 years of testosterone exposure, and that has implications, in terms of my ability to be in competitive sports. But like I said, like, a lot of the trans community is a little bit on edge, and even if it's not law, when you hear people at, like, things like CPAC calling for the trans community to be eradicated, or when you hear people saying things like, anytime something happens that is even remotely potentially tied to the trans community, it's like we need to lock them all up in camps. And I recognize that these aren't government officials necessarily, but these are people with 1 million followers on Twitter, who are followed by government officials, saying things like that. So the community's on edge, and I think we have reasonable fears that if our protections are eliminated, that people will try to take advantage of the elimination of our protections.
Yeah, what in that podcast I saw, what Chase Strangio said, their concern is if the other side prevails, is that it would help build fascist institutions, which is, I mean, that's a pretty hardcore
Yeah, like I try to look up.
consequence.
Yeah, yeah, I see where he's heading. But I probably wouldn't use the language, just once again optics, because I think people just when you say fascism, people assume it's an overreaction. But whether it builds fascist institutions or just gives free rein to governments that are already predisposed to anti-trans animus to write it into law. I think that is like when I say this issue really isn't about sports. That's what I'm
Right.
worried about. It's like that sport, the questions around sports are going to be used as a vehicle to open up a door to for states to more widely legislate against trans people. So I know we should probably wrap up shortly, but I know like we do every week, anything that I know we generally agree to disagree, but is there anything that I said that you maybe agreed with, or that you maybe I know obviously there was some, but anything that you didn't agree with before we started talking today?
A takeaway for me is the lack of opportunity, like structured socialization around sex, that for kids in particular, that would be inclusive of boys who identify as girls and girls who identify as boys. There is a little bit of a paucity there. And I do understand that co-ed is not completely the same, though girls and boys will tend to congregate with each other anyway,
Yeah.
allowing that opportunity while maintaining um, while not like breaching a single sex expectation.
Yeah. And actually, even as you're saying that, I was sort of thinking of the co-ed sports that I played because I played recreational ultimate. It wasn't my main sport, which is like the frisbee sport, and it's mandatorily a co-ed sport, or at least at most levels. Maybe at really high levels it's not. And our team had to have 3 women. In these leagues I was counted as a woman, but the women all kind of hung out together, and we got to know each other, even though we were playing with and against men. It still was an opportunity, and maybe and I know I often in the past have kind of poo-pooed on co-ed sports, saying it's not the same, but there may be some elements that you can get at least some of those benefits, and I think they at least should be encouraged, even if we don't want to say full out that women shouldn't participate on women's teams. But what you said kind of got to me was when we were arguing about sort of safety issues, which is like even though I know we quibbled about the Peyton McNabb instance specifically, is that one of the things I recognize is it's very hard to police. And you can as a trans person, like if I was like I said, I'm personally not strong, but if I was taller and stronger, even though let's say I would have been okay, I'm going to take a little off that spike, or I'm going to take a little bit off that, or if I'm going into the corner, like if I'm playing hockey and I'm going to the board, I'm going to let off a little bit and not maybe give my full strength. There's no guarantee. Like, how do you draw the line between, well, seemed like a real hard body check versus a slightly body check where you held off a little, or was that a spike that was full effort versus one that was 80% effort? Those become very hard to police, and I can understand at any point where it's in sports where there is the opportunity for hurt. And even though girls do hurt each other, if you throw too many boys in, there is a different velocity and different strength that goes in that does become hard to police. And if I'm going to advocate for this, we've got to find a better way to work around, to develop a solution for that. So, anyways, great show again. I know I made a promise to you last time that I wouldn't talk as much, and I may have broken it.
Oh, I don't know. I'm feeling better this week, and I have spoken more.
Okay.
So I think it's
We're
more
working towards a
balanced.
solution. We're working towards a solution, and our listeners are free to point out all the times when I yammer too much, and I'm happy to hear it. So once again, please, we're going to be please share your thoughts in the comments. We're always looking forward for ideas for future shows. And if there's anything if there's any people you'd like to see interviews, any changes you'd like to see the format, please let us know, because we recognize that we're doing the show. We'd probably do the show anyways, even if we didn't have viewers, because I just love talking to Yvette. But it's great to have people who are also interested in these conversations.
Well, thank you.
All right. So goodbye, everybody.